Well, we are down to our final two chapters, Genesis 24 and 25, as we conclude the story of Abraham with the marriage of Isaac and then ultimately Abraham's death. We pick up the story in verse 1 of chapter 24, where it reads, "Now Abraham was old and well advanced in years. And the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, See to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, To your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you. You shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning the matter. The story of Abraham is drawing ever closer to a conclusion. In our last study, Sarah died. And Abraham negotiated the purchase of a cave and a few acres around it as his permanent personal property, where the family tomb would be established. So Abraham's reached that point in life where he realizes there's a lot more past than there is future in this world. If we live long enough, we all reach a point where one day we wake up and realize it's closer to the end than it is the beginning. When I think about the fact that it's been over 40 years since I graduated high school, and some 30 years since I graduated seminary, and in 6 months I qualify to go on Social Security if I so choose. No matter how healthy I may feel and how long I may live, unless I'm going to set a bunch of records, I'm a whole lot closer to the end than I am to the beginning. That's just reality. And when you get to that point in life, if you're at all a thoughtful person, and not everybody is, some people just kind of live in the moment, kind of lurch from day to day, but for most of us, there comes a point where you begin to think, what have I done? Where am I? How close have I come to achieving the goals that I had when I was young? And what am I leaving behind? Are things well taken care of? Have I provided for my family? Have I provided for my heirs? Have I done the job that I need to do to be a responsible parent, grandparent, whatever? And you get the impression just from the text here that Abraham's having one of those moments. And it's frequent that when we suffer a significant loss, like the death of a spouse, that it puts us in that kind of a reflective mood. And so it's not surprising that the next thing you see is Abraham worrying about making sure that his son makes a good marriage. Now, by this point, Isaac's 40-something. So it's not like he's rushing into marriage. And we can only speculate as to why Isaac has delayed marriage to this point, and it may well be the problem of finding a suitable bride. Abraham is quite emphatic with his servant, and we don't know the name of the servant here. It can be speculated that perhaps this is Eleazar, the man, the Syrian man, who earlier on, before Ishmael or Isaac was born, Abraham was speculating Eleazar was going to be his heir, since he didn't have a blood descendant to give his property to. If so, then Eleazar is in any event a very old man by this point, because he's listed as the eldest of all of Abraham's servants. But he's still young enough to take on, or at least hardy enough, to take on a rigorous trip. A trip that would be some 1,000 miles in length by the time we're not talking about a super highway that takes him up to the northern end of the Euphrates Valley. This is a donkey trail, a camel trail, and it would have been a very slow, arduous, difficult journey. But he's up to it. But Abraham is so concerned about the kind of person that Isaac marries, and even more importantly, the kind of family that he marries into, that he's quite emphatic that his servant must go back to his extended family, back in Haran, to find a bride for Isaac. Now, once again, we can only speculate. Has there been any communication between Abraham and his family back in Haran? There's no record of it. And if there had been any communication, it would have been very limited, because there's not a postal service in this world. People don't routinely travel great distances unless they are part of a caravan. And to get any kind of communication from Abraham to his brother in Haran would have been difficult and uncertain at best. There'd be no guarantee that the communication would ever be received. What's more, we have no way of knowing if Abraham's family in Haran was even literate. Most people in that world at that time could not read and write. So, the message would probably have had to have been sent orally, if at all. So there's no reason to assume at this point that there's been any communication at all between Abraham and his family back in Haran. And it is only, again, based on what we have here, Abraham is only assuming that there is some woman of marriageable age that would be an appropriate wife for Isaac. This is a real shot in the dark. And you got to put yourself in Isaac's position, Arranged marriages were the norm in that world, but at least in most cases, you at least had some idea who the bride's going to be. He's got no clue. He's got no name. He's got no direct connection. He doesn't know who among his relatives this would-be bride is coming from. So he's really, he's got a real big vested interest in this, and he's flying blind. The nature of the oath is kind of peculiar and definitely strange from our perspective 4,000 years in the future. It says that Abraham had his servant put his hand under his thigh. And, I mean, we're talking some pretty intimate body parts here. And it had very powerful symbolic significance. And it almost certainly relates back to God's covenant relationship with Abraham, which in Abraham's case was signified by circumcision. So this is a vow on the covenant. That's about as solemn a vow as Abraham could require of his servant. This speaks to the very heart of Abraham's faith relationship with God. So this is real important stuff, he's saying. Everything is riding on this. It is absolutely essential that Isaac take a wife suitable for the one through whom the covenant promise is going to be kept. All Abraham had to do was look around his neighbors and said, these folks will not do. Remember who the Canaanites are. These are people who are practicing all kinds of vile and offensive idolatry. They are engaged in behavior that ultimately will put them under God's ban when Joshua invades the Canaanite lands with the orders to kill everything that's moving. One of the harshest orders ever ordered by anybody anywhere. And it was God's demand that these people be exterminated because of their toxic influence. And as I've shared before, the orders were not kept, they were not exterminated, and it would be generation after generation of grief to Israel as a consequence. So Abraham is trying to set Isaac out on the right path. Now, it goes back to this weird intermarriage that was a part of Abraham's family heritage. Remember at the beginning of this study, I gave you a copy of this bizarre family tree. And Abraham is sending his servant, and the person that he ultimately contacts is Bethuel and Laban. Bethuel was Abraham's nephew, the son of Abraham's brother Nahor, the daughter of Abraham's niece Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, another of Abraham's brothers. So already we got intermarriage here at an unhealthy level. Well, Bethuel has a son Laban and a daughter Rebekah. If there are other children, they're not mentioned. So Abraham would have been Rebekah's great uncle. Isaac would have been Rebekah's second cousin. And again, it's even closer than that when you factor in the fact that Sarah was Abraham's half-sister, and Bethuel, was related both to Nahor and to Haran. So we've got genetic strands that are coming together in a really dangerous combination. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the study, it's no wonder that sterility shows up repeatedly in the family tree. Because, we know now from the dangers of intermarriage that this is a really unhealthy situation. But what is unhealthy physically is very healthy spiritually. Abraham is trying to preserve the purity of the spiritual strain, even if he is unaware of the genetic dangers of all this. He wants a clean break between his son and the Canaanites around him. At the same time, he does not want Isaac to leave Canaan. He's quite emphatic about that as well. The servant said, well, do I need to end up taking Isaac back to Ur to find a relative that he can marry if the folks in Haran are not amenable to this? And Abraham is very emphatic about that because, again, it goes back to the covenant. Abraham is going to do everything in his power to make sure that Isaac fulfills his obligation as the next generation of the covenant. That means staying in the land. Unlike Abraham, there's no record of Isaac ever leaving Canaan. He doesn't go down to Egypt. He doesn't go to Haran. He stays put. That covenant promise is tied with this man and this land. And Abraham does all that he can to make sure that that comes off as needed. And so, what stands out above all else in these words of Abraham, and by the way, this is the last words of Abraham recorded in Genesis. This is the last thing we have of his stated. It is his expression of faith in God and in God's covenant. It's interesting that the first words that we have recorded of Abraham back in chapter 15 were words of doubt. You know, how's this promise going to be kept? Abraham's come a long ways in the 100+ years between those events. It's also important to notice as the story unfolds how God is at work in the circumstances. This is not one of your typical biblical miracle stories. You know, the sun doesn't stop in the heavens. People aren't walking on water. There are no angelic visitations. There's no, supernatural dream. What happens is highly unusual and highly improbable, but these are all natural events that God directed, which in some ways, frankly, I find even more incredible, because it's what God is reminding all of us is all of life is a miracle. If God is in control of your life, if you have submitted yourself to His promise, and you're being faithful in trying to be obedient to Him, He will, and He promises in His Word, He will direct your path. He will guide you step by step. Now, sometimes the guidance is very overt, sometimes it's very subtle. But in this story, we see it played out in a pretty dramatic way. So the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. And he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord God, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. Once again, put yourself in the position of the servant. He has absolutely nothing by which to identify who it is he's looking for. You know, he doesn't have a photograph. He doesn't have a description. It's been decades since Abraham has laid eyes on any of these people. It's doubtful Abraham even knows which ones are still alive. And so all he can give him are a couple names and a general area. But again, we're talking about people who are, in all likelihood, and based on we learn later about Laban, we have evidence to support it, these are also herdsmen. People who don't sit tight in one place. So he's got a general area that he's going to have to search high and low just to find the right family. It would have been a daunting task. You know, people are scattered all over this area. And I mean, we're talking many miles. He could have spent weeks looking for the right people. But the very first place he comes to is this well outside the town. And he prays a prayer that is worthy of his master. And notice he uses Abraham's name in the prayer. He's not asking God, do this for my benefit. Do this for the sake of your servant Abraham. Do this to fulfill your promise to Abraham. This is not only a faithful servant, he's a wise one. He prays well, given the circumstances. We don't know how well he knows this God he's praying to, but he knows his master, and he knows the lofty place that his master places as far as this God and his trustworthiness. He's seen enough, he's heard enough, he's a believer. This is a prayer of somebody who trusts Abraham's God. And what he asks is not miraculous, but it's pretty amazing. He's gone to an area that's, the name means the land within the river. It's bounded on three sides by the Euphrates River. He's got 10 camels. They've just traveled some 1,000 miles in some very arid country. And so he prays, may the woman who comes and greets me, who I ask for water, will she not only give me that water, but will she on her own initiative volunteer to water my camels? Abraham has 10 thirsty camels. Again, think about the setting. We're talking about a typical Middle Eastern well. Now, this is not normally the kind of thing that you would imagine from the movie The Ten Commandments, when Charlton Heston is laying under the date palm tree and the daughters are drawing well, and they've got this nice little stone wall around the well, something like, you know, out of a Kincaid painting. The reality of those wells, in most cases, it was a hole dug in the ground with steps dug into the sides of the clay that you had to walk down into to get to the part of the area where the water was. And even then, sometimes you had to draw it with a bucket out of a hole. But these wells were hand dug, and in some cases they went down 50, 60 feet or deeper to get to the place where you could get to the water. So to draw water was an incredibly difficult, physically demanding task. So you imagine, you know, Rebecca is carrying a water jar, and these typically would hold about 3 gallons. The jar by itself was heavy because it's made of fired clay. 3 gallons of water, you know, I'm old enough to remember carrying 5-gallon buckets of water or slop to take to the hogs when I was living on the farm in high school. 5 gallons of water is unbelievably heavy. Well, 3 gallons in a clay jar is not much better. And we're not talking about a teenage boy, we're talking about a young woman. A camel, 1 camel, can drink upwards of 25 gallons of water at a sitting when thirsty. She's got 10 of them to water. She's got to make possibly as many as 100 trips up and down those steps with that 3-gallon water jar, hauling it from where the water is up there to where she can pour it into the trough for the camels. We're talking about at least 2 hours of hard manual labor. So this is a woman, she volunteers to do this. She's seen camels before. She knows what she's getting into. So this says of her character, this is a very gracious, generous soul who's strong as a horse. So when the servant prayed the prayer, he's not only asking for God to direct things in a dramatic, almost supernatural way, but he's praying a prayer that by the very nature of the prayer is going to identify a generous, strong woman who'd make a good wife. the kind of person you'd want your son to marry. So it was a really good prayer. And God answered it spot on. Now, bear in mind, it's obvious at first glance that this is an important man. He would have had a large company of people with him. He's carrying valuable gold and precious gifts. That means an armed guard, because this is countryside where bandits roam freely. So he had 10 camels because he needed 10 camels to carry his goods. No doubt there were other horses, donkeys, whatever, with this company. And so at first glance, this young woman would have looked up and said, boy, you know, we got a VIP at the well today. And she treated him like one. She has no idea who this guy is. He hasn't introduced himself. You know, they spoke the same language. So that at least would have been a clue. But not much of one. Well, we move on. Notice his prayer is being answered before he finishes uttering it, while he is still speaking. Behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, please give me a little water to drink from your jar. And she said, drink, my lord. And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. So while she's working up a rolling sweat, after a couple hours of hard physical labor, Abraham's servant just silently watches. And you got to imagine that he's having a hard time containing the smile as he sees his prayer being answered. It's all coming together. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing half a shekel. A shekel was about 2/5 of an ounce, 11 grams of gold. So a nice gold ring. 2 bracelets from her arms weighing 10 gold shekels, and said, please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. She added, we have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. For as for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. You can almost see her eyes get big at this point. This clearly important man who's giving her gold, who's got this whole, small army of people with him, suddenly introduces himself as the servant of Abraham, her great uncle, her father's uncle. Somebody that she's no doubt heard about all her life as this distant, kind of mysterious figure that left the family years ago and headed off somewhere to the west of Canaan. So he would have been a mysterious, kind of romantic figure in her world. A name without a face. And now this person out of the past has sent his servant, and she's just watered his camels. You know, this has got to be the biggest event in her life. And so she does the thing you'd expect a young girl to do. She drops her jar and she goes running back to the tent to tell Mama what's happened. Now, bear in mind, Isaac would have been probably early 40s at this point. She's the next generation younger. So she's probably late teens, early 20s, something like that. She's, you know, it would have been typical for women in that day to marry rather young, and she's still a virgin. She's never been married. So she would have been a young woman of marriageable age. And so, Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. The word Laban in the Hebrew literally means the white one. And it's a poetic term for the moon. Remember Abraham's ancestry. He came from a family of moon worshippers in Ur. And the rest of his family at this point, we have no reason to believe are anything other than moon worshippers. If you recall the story from earlier, they went from one center of moon worship, Ur, to another center of moon worship, Haran. And so, even though they're not Canaanites, they're not followers of the God of Abraham either. Laban, as the story unfolds and goes beyond the story of Abraham directly, when we get to his dealings with Jacob, we learn that Laban is a rascal. You know, he's greedy. He's a money grubber. He would have been the first thing he would have noticed when Rebekah came into the tent with that story was that gold ring and that gold bracelet. I guarantee you, it would have caught his eye immediately. In fact, it says Laban. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Laban ran out toward the man to the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms and heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, thus the man spoke to me, he went to the man. So, yeah, follow the money. That's Laban's philosophy. And behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I have prepared the house and a place for the camels." You know, Laban has immediately become the focal point of the story. You know, never mind what Rebekah's just done. You know, 2 hours of watering the camels. I have prepared you a place. Come. You know, you know, he's shifting the focus from Rebekah to him. So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels and gave straw and fodder to the camels, and there was water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, "I will not eat until I have said what I have to say." He said, "Speak on." Now is the point at which the servant tells Abraham's story. "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become great." And you can see at this point Laban hanging on every word. He's given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male servants and female servants, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, "You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house and to my clan and take a wife for my son." And so he goes on, he tells the whole story almost verbatim as it was recorded earlier in the chapter. "I came here to the spring," and then he repeats the prayer that he offered. "And before I'd finished speaking, here comes Rebekah." Now then, if you're going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may return to the right hand or to the left. I've come here looking for a bride for my master's son. Are we going to have a deal here or not? So, you know, he spent a long time getting there, but he's not spending much time in negotiations. He sets out the story. I am offering to Rebekah a great match. A man that has a father who's been blessed by God, who's received the blessings of God, who is wealthy beyond your imagination. He's got silver, he's got gold, he's got herds, he's got slaves. He's got God's eye of protection upon him. And his father doesn't want him to marry any of the local girls. So you've got the inside track here. Do I have a bride for my servant's son or not? Let's not beat around the bush here. Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you good or bad. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go. Let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. Now, there's no mention here of dowry being exchanged or anything like that. It's clear that Bethuel and Laban are of one mind that this is going to be a good marriage for Rebekah. And there's probably something in it for them. Then Abraham's servant heard their words and bowed himself to the earth before the Lord. And the servant brought out jewelry of silver and gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave to the brother and to her mother costly ornaments. And he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. When they rose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. Now, he got there late in the day. It was evening. In the ancient Middle East, it was typical for women to draw water at the well early in the morning and late in the evening. It was a practical matter. During the midday, the sun is scorching hot for much of the year, so they try to avoid the heat of the day for this heavy work. So he hasn't been in town for 24 hours. He spent the night, he got up the next morning, he's ready to head back. Now, the urgency of Abraham's servant at this point has kind of caught him off guard. You know, they've expected a few days of feasting at the very least. And so her brother and her mother, and you can just imagine Mama at this point, you know, at lunchtime the day before, she had a daughter that didn't have a suitor. And now this stranger who she met a few hours ago is wanting to take her with him right then. And said, you know, let the young woman remain with us while at least 10 days. After that she may go. You know, let us have time to get used to the idea. But he said, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. They said, well, let us call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? She said, I will go. So they sent Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men, and they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate them. Then Rebekah and her young woman arose and rode on the camels and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now, you know, it's an old saying. People talk about you can't get good help these days. Well, Abraham had good help.
Yes, he did.
You talk about a trustworthy servant. He made a beeline for the right place. He happened upon the exact right person right off the bat. And in less than a day and a half, he has made an about face. He's headed back to Hebron. which says, even though it was a long journey, by the time he got back, he had to have arrived much earlier than anybody would have expected. Realistically, they had to have assumed it would take him much longer than it did to find the right place, to find the right girl, to close the deal, and to be coming back. Now Isaac had returned from Beer Lahai Roi and was dwelling in the Negev. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening. He lifted up his eyes and saw, behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes. And when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. You know, it's like a tale out of a novel. Late in the day, Isaac's out, it says meditating. The image we have of Isaac in the scripture is of a quiet, thoughtful, sort of stay-at-home kind of guy. We don't know how long it's been since his mother died, but he's still mourning her. Apparently it had been at least a few months. You know, so he was, you get the impression, kind of a mama's boy who really missed mama. And again, you think about the unusual circumstances here. A boy born to elderly parents late in their life. Often the relationship is a little unusual, and sometimes it can be very close. You know, this was literally the answer to their prayers, this young boy, and so they doted on him. I'm sure they spoiled him. And the absence, you know, and it's always a little unusual when you have a child who's growing up with very elderly parents. It's a different kind of relationship that you see there. And so the void that was left when Sarah died was a big one for him. So he's out, you know, you get the impression, you know, sort of moping around a little bit. Meditating, sort of a vague word. I mean, he could have been praying, or he could have been just kind of mourning. And he looked up and he saw the camels coming. Now, at first he doesn't know who it is, and then he gets close enough, he recognizes his father's servant, and he sees that girl, and she sees him. And you know, the first people that, you know, first person she sees in Canaan is her soon-to-be husband. I mean, it's really kind of romantic. And as soon as she realizes who it is, she covers herself. Now, again, we tend to confuse the modern world of the Middle East with the world of 4,000 years ago. And I guarantee you, nobody was going around in burqas 4,000 years ago. That is a late invention of Islam. It had nothing to do with the world of Abraham. Veils did exist, but women didn't go around veiled most of the time. This was her way of saying, I'm a bride. And so she's veiling herself so that there can be the unveiling at the time of her wedding. You know, it's almost her way of saying, you know, I'm still signed on for this. You know, it would have been the same effect if she'd had an engagement ring and she'd flash the diamond. You know, I'm your bride. And once again, there wasn't much ceremony on the other end when the deal was struck, and there's not much ceremony on this end. The servant told Isaac what had happened. Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and they were married. Not a lot of ritual here. I heard the other day that the average wedding today in America costs over $30,000 when everything's added up. Now, if you take Manhattan out of the equation, it's more like $15,000. That's how screwed up things have become with these high-priced weddings. All these arrangements, all these details, this is about as simple as it gets. Come on into the tent, you're married. Interesting. She became his wife and he loved her. This is the first place in the Bible where romantic love is mentioned. So apparently it was love at first sight. So Abraham has completed his last task in life. He secured a wife, a good wife, a woman who would be a godly wife, through whom the promise would be continued to another generation. Now, if Hollywood was doing this story, next day Abraham would die and we'd be buried and we'd move on. Well, there's not a lot written here, but there's a lot that still goes on. Abraham takes another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Suha. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Debon, the sons of Dedan and Ashiram, and I'm not even going to bother reading the rest of these. Notice these names, though. They are names that would later be associated with the Arabian Peninsula. Keturah the name Keturah means spice. And it is the Arabian Peninsula that would become the center of the spice trade in the Middle East. When I was in Yemen a few years ago, went to the souk, the old marketplace in Sana'a, the capital city, and to this day you can go into the old city and there are vendors with big trays covered with all kinds of spices. In my office I've got frankincense and myrrh that I picked up there in the old market there in Sana'a. Stuff that has been sold and traded in that part of the world for thousands of years. Remember God's promise to Abraham, I will make you the father of nations. The suggestion here is that from these sons, from this wife late in life, a whole bunch of other clans and tribes and people groups would descend. All of these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. We get nothing but just a tiny little report here. A wife late in life. They have 6 sons and possibly daughters. Often daughters are not even listed in these chronologies. And then while he's still alive, Abraham sends them away. Now it's not that he disliked them. There's no evidence, there's no reason to believe that he wished them ill. But this was one last little bow that he could put on the package of the covenant for his son. He wanted it absolutely clear that the promise was by God's own word going to come through Isaac. That the covenant relationship was through Isaac. It wasn't through Ishmael. It wasn't through these sons late in life. it was through Isaac and Isaac only. Unless there be any kind of rivalry after Abraham died that might cause some question or some possibility of in effect, a palace coup, Abraham wanted to guarantee up front that wasn't going to happen. So he sent them on with his blessings, but not with the covenant promise. These are the days of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, in the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife, and the death of Abraham, and after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled in Beer Lahai Roi. If you will recall, long before this, Ishmael had departed to regions west, somewhere out in Sinai. Yet he's here when Abraham dies. From that we can logically assume that Abraham didn't just drop dead one day, that his health was failing for a period of time, and that some kind of contact or communication had been maintained with Ishmael, at least sufficient that word could be sent to him so they would be able to let him know that Abraham was dying, and he would have time to get back there to be there with him when he died. All that is not stated specifically, but it's a logical inference from the text. He died after a period of illness or weakening. I'm not saying that he was real sick. We've all seen it happen. Somebody who's very elderly who just begins to fail. And you can tell they're getting weaker. It's not going to be much longer. In any event, there was enough warning that they could get word to Ishmael. And Ishmael came. And Ishmael and Isaac together buried their father. So whatever tensions had been separating Ishmael and Isaac were not so grievous that they couldn't at least come together for their dad's funeral. And we've all seen families where the rivalries between siblings were so bitter that they couldn't even come together at the death of a parent. Then it lists the generations of Ishmael, and we went through that material with the family tree at the beginning of the study, so I won't repeat that again. And the chapter closes up with the birth of Esau and Jacob, the twins. And Rebekah, during her pregnancy, the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" And she went to inquire of the Lord. She's having a difficult pregnancy. There's a lot of activity. Now, at this point, there's no reason to believe that she realized she has twins, but maybe she's beginning to get suspicious. And God informs her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And it's significant that God tells this to Rebekah, but not to Isaac. And whether Rebekah ever told Isaac or not is not clear, but it sets up from her pregnancy tensions that will rack that family from that day for years to come. This rivalry between Jacob and Esau. And unfortunately, that's a story that goes beyond our study. Because we have wrapped up the life of Abraham, and I hope you have enjoyed this study as much as I have enjoyed teaching it. We got just a few minutes. Any parting questions before we wrap it up? Yes, sir.
This came up. I was thinking about this. The term Israelites. When did that come into view? I mean, I may have missed this.
You haven't missed it because it hasn't happened yet. Israel was the name that will later be given to Jacob. And it was a consequence of a restless night that Jacob spent wrestling with what he didn't know at the time was an angel. And Israel, as I recall, literally means overcomer of God or something to that effect. And so it was a kind of a nickname given to him after he spent the night wrestling with an angel. And it became synonymous. And in Scripture, Israel can refer to the nation, or it can refer specifically to Jacob. And the context will determine which is the appropriate application. But initially, it was the name of Jacob, and it would later then come to be identified with the whole nation, all of Jacob's 12 sons. Good question. Anyone else? Well, thank you for being an attentive audience.